At 8:17 a.m., Canada announced a deal so large it instantly changed the trade war narrative. What had been framed for months as a story of pressure, leverage, and American dominance suddenly became something very different. In Ottawa, officials stepped before cameras and confirmed a sweeping multi-billion-dollar agreement covering energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and strategic minerals. Within minutes, traders on both sides of the border were reacting, lawmakers in Washington were demanding briefings, and one uncomfortable question began spreading through political circles. Had Trump's strategy just backfired in spectacular fashion? The timing alone made the announcement explosive. For weeks, tensions had been rising after repeated tariff threats, sharp rhetoric, and escalating pressure from Washington. The expectation among many analysts was that Canada would eventually be forced into concessions. Instead, Canada emerged with a deal that suggested the opposite had happened. Rather than becoming weaker under pressure, it had found new markets, new buyers, and new leverage. The symbolism was immediate and powerful. This was not merely an economic agreement, it was a response. Canadian officials described the pact as a long-term growth framework designed to secure jobs, stabilize exports, and reduce vulnerability to external political pressure. The language was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. Canada had spent months preparing alternatives while Washington assumed it still held the upper hand. Inside the White House, aides reportedly began reviewing the details almost as soon as the headlines hit. Trade advisors wanted numbers. Political staff wanted messaging. Markets wanted answers. Because once the scale of the agreement became clear, it was obvious this was not a ceremonial announcement. It involved real money, real shipments, real contracts, and real strategic consequences. Preliminary estimates suggested tens of billions in new commitments over multiple years, with pathways for expansion if conditions improved. The sectors included in the deal made it even more significant. Canadian energy exports were expected to gain expanded access. Agricultural producers, especially wheat and food exporters, stood to benefit from guaranteed purchase volumes. Manufacturing components would receive preferred treatment under new supply arrangements. Critical minerals used in batteries and advanced technology were also included, giving the agreement a strategic dimension beyond ordinary trade. In other words, this was not one contract. It was an economic architecture. In Washington, that raised a painful contrast. The Trump strategy had relied heavily on the idea that aggressive pressure could force trading partners into favorable terms. Tariffs, threats, and public confrontation were presented as tools of strength. But in this case, the targeted country had not folded, it had diversified, and by doing so publicly, it turned defense into offense. Cable news networks quickly shifted programming. Analysts pointed out that if Canada could successfully reduce dependence on U.S. pressure tactics, other countries might study the same model. That possibility mattered far beyond North America. Trade leverage works best when the other side has no alternative. Canada had just announced one. Markets responded with speed. The Canadian dollar strengthened as investors viewed the agreement as supportive for exports and long-term growth. Shares tied to logistics, rail transport, and commodity movements saw immediate attention. U.S. sectors exposed to cross-border competition faced more mixed reactions as traders recalculated pricing power and future market share. Financial markets do not react emotionally. They react to changing incentives. And the incentives had changed in one morning. The political optics were just as severe. Trump had built much of his trade reputation on public displays of dominance. The narrative depended on visible wins and the image of foreign governments responding to American demands. But now cameras around the world were focused on Canada announcing gains while Washington looked surprised. For critics, it was evidence that confrontation can create unintended consequences. For supporters, it was a challenge that demanded a counterstrike. For neutral observers, it was simply a strategic reversal. Canadian leadership understood the moment. Their tone remained measured but confident. They emphasized resilience, diversification, and economic sovereignty. They praised workers, exporters, and domestic industries for adapting under pressure. Without directly escalating rhetoric, they made clear that Canada had options and intended to use them. That message resonated because it was backed by contracts, not speeches. In the hours that followed, lawmakers in Washington began asking whether previous assumptions about leverage had been wrong. If tariffs and threats were pushing allies into new alliances, then the long-term costs could exceed the short-term gains. Business leaders quietly raised similar concerns. Supply chains depend on predictability, and predictability had become harder to find. What made the announcement so disruptive was not only the money involved, It was the story it told. A campaign of pressure designed to isolate Canada had instead encouraged Canada to expand outward. A strategy meant to demonstrate strength had created an opportunity for someone else. That is why the reaction in Washington was so intense. The numbers mattered, but the symbolism mattered more, because in geopolitics, perception can move almost as fast as markets. And on that morning, the perception shifted dramatically. Trump tried to squeeze Canada. Instead, Canada just got stronger. For months, the strategy appeared simple. Apply pressure, raise tariffs, escalate rhetoric, and force concessions. It was a model built on confrontation and presented as strength. Trump's trade approach toward Canada followed a familiar pattern: create uncertainty, increase the economic cost of resistance, and assume the other side would eventually return to the table on weaker terms. In Washington, supporters argued that aggressive tactics were long overdue. They claimed previous administrations had been too cautious, too diplomatic, too willing to accept imbalanced arrangements. This time, they said, America would negotiate from raw leverage. But what looked powerful in theory began producing a very different result in practice. Instead of folding under pressure, Canada adapted. And in doing so, it exposed one of the oldest weaknesses in coercive strategy. When you squeeze a partner too hard, that partner starts looking for another door. The first phase of the pressure campaign relied on tariffs and repeated public threats. Industries that depended on cross-border trade suddenly faced uncertainty. Manufacturers wondered whether costs would rise. Agricultural producers feared retaliation. Currency markets reacted to each new headline. The atmosphere itself became part of the strategy. If enough uncertainty was created, Canada would be pushed into concessions simply to restore stability. That was the assumption. But assumptions can become dangerous when they ignore incentives on the other side. Canada's leadership understood that waiting passively carried long-term risk. If one market could become a political weapon overnight, dependence on that market had become a vulnerability. So instead of responding only with speeches or symbolic retaliation, Canada began accelerating something more important: diversification. Trade delegations intensified outreach abroad. Energy infrastructure planning gained urgency. Exporters searched for alternative buyers. Supply chains were reevaluated. Quietly, steadily, Canada began preparing for a future in which pressure from Washington mattered less. This is where the strategy started to reverse. Pressure is effective when the target has no realistic alternatives. But the moment alternatives begin forming, leverage starts to erode. Every new customer, every new contract, every new shipping route reduces the force of the original threat. By trying to corner Canada, the administration incentivized Canada to become less cornerable. That is not just a diplomatic problem. It is a structural one. Businesses responded even faster than governments. Canadian exporters, who once prioritized easy access to the U.S. market, began exploring Asia, Europe, and other growth regions. Investors funded logistics, ports, and processing capacity designed for wider distribution. Commodity producers asked a practical question: if access to one market can change with politics, why rely on only one market at all? Once companies start making those calculations, policy pressure begins losing power. Because business adapts to incentives faster than politics adapts to headlines, allies also watched closely. Nations that had their own trade tensions with Washington saw an opportunity. If Canada wanted new partnerships, others were willing to talk. Some saw economic upside. Others saw geopolitical advantage. Either way, the result was the same. The more intense the pressure became, the more space opened for competitors and new alliances. What had started as a bilateral confrontation was turning into a global market reshuffle. Trump's public rhetoric may have energized supporters domestically, but internationally it created another challenge. Negotiation through visible threats can produce quick headlines, yet it can also damage trust. Governments make long-term agreements based not only on price, but on reliability. If policy can swing sharply through political impulse, partners begin pricing that instability into every future relationship. That does not always show up immediately, but over time, it changes behavior. And behavior is where real leverage lies. Canada's eventual massive deal did not appear overnight. It was the product of months of accelerated planning under pressure. Every tariff threat created urgency. Every hostile headline strengthened the political case for diversification inside Canada. Every attempt to increase dependence produced more motivation to reduce it. In that sense, the deal was not separate from Trump's strategy. It was partially created by it. The pressure was designed to weaken Canada. It forced Canada to adapt. That is the strategic irony at the center of this moment. Supporters of hardline tactics often assume pain flows only one direction, but modern economies are networks, not battlefields. When one side disrupts the system, all players start adjusting. Some lose, some gain, some discover entirely new opportunities. Canada appears to have found one. There is also a broader lesson here for trade politics. Fear can move markets quickly, but it rarely builds durable advantage. Long-term strength usually comes from innovation, optionality, and stable relationships. If aggressive tactics cause your counterpart to become more independent, then even a short-term win can become a long-term loss. By the time Washington recognized the scale of Canada's response, the narrative had already changed. The administration wanted leverage. Canada built resilience. The administration wanted concessions. Canada found alternatives. The administration wanted dominance. Canada announced a massive deal. And once that happened publicly, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. What was supposed to be a show of strength had triggered strategic escape. What was meant to pressure a partner had helped transform that partner. In trade wars, force can create movement, but sometimes it moves the other side beyond your reach. When Canada finally revealed the agreement, the headline number alone was enough to command global attention. It was described as a multi-billion-dollar package with long-term commitments across several critical industries, large enough to reshape export flows, strengthen domestic employment, and send a direct signal to Washington that Canada had more options than many assumed. But the real significance of the deal was not just its size, it was its design. This was not a single transaction, not one shipment, not one symbolic memorandum signed for cameras. It was a layered economic strategy built to reduce vulnerability, increase bargaining power, and reposition Canada inside a rapidly changing global trade environment. At the center of the agreement was energy. Canada remains one of the world's most resource-rich economies, and energy exports are a major pillar of national revenue. Under the New Deal, expanded purchase commitments were reportedly tied to future supply guarantees, infrastructure cooperation, and pricing frameworks that offered greater stability than volatile spot markets. That mattered for two reasons. First, it created predictable demand for Canadian producers. Second, it reduced the strategic importance of relying too heavily on any one buyer. In a period where trade pressure had become political leverage, guaranteed alternative demand was a form of national insurance. Agriculture formed another major pillar. Canadian wheat, grains, fertilizer inputs, and food exports were positioned to benefit from new access terms and multi-year purchasing commitments. For farmers in rural communities, this was not abstract geopolitics. It meant contracts, transportation demand, storage expansion, and stronger income visibility. Agricultural markets often react sharply to policy shifts, tariffs, and trade barriers. A large, diversified agreement offered something producers value deeply: certainty. And certainty can be worth almost as much as price. Then came strategic minerals, one of the most important parts of the entire package. Canada holds significant reserves of minerals essential to batteries, electronics, clean energy systems, and advanced manufacturing. In the modern economy, access to these materials is increasingly tied to national security and industrial policy. By including critical minerals in the agreement, Canada was not just selling commodities, it was positioning itself inside future technology supply chains. That move likely attracted serious international attention because control over inputs often matters more than control over finished products. Manufacturing was another key section of the pact. Reports indicated new incentives for industrial cooperation, component exports, machinery contracts, and production partnerships. That meant Canadian factories producing everything from industrial parts to processed materials could gain wider market reach. Ports, rail corridors, trucking networks, and warehousing systems would likely benefit as goods volumes increased. Trade deals are often discussed in terms of diplomacy, but they become real through logistics. If products move, jobs follow. If infrastructure expands, regional economies feel it. Technology and research cooperation were also embedded in the broader framework. While less visible than raw commodity headlines, these sections may prove among the most valuable over time. Joint investment in clean energy systems, data infrastructure, manufacturing efficiency, and innovation partnerships can generate benefits that compound for years. Canada appeared to understand something larger than short-term retaliation. The strongest response to pressure is not revenge, but modernization. Politically, the agreement was packaged with careful discipline. Canadian officials emphasized resilience, opportunity, and long-term competitiveness rather than open confrontation. They praised domestic workers, producers, exporters, and communities. But beneath the measured language was a clear message to the world. Canada had been pressured and had responded by broadening its economic map. That message resonated because it was backed by scale. Thousands of jobs were expected to be supported directly or indirectly through extraction, farming, manufacturing, shipping, engineering, and service sectors tied to the new flows of trade. Provinces with strong resource and industrial bases stood to gain. Port cities anticipated cargo growth, rail operators expected increased demand, financial institutions began evaluating investment opportunities linked to expanded production and infrastructure needs. In short, the deal did not just create headlines. It created momentum. International observers also understood the strategic symbolism. Canada is often viewed as deeply integrated with the United States economically, and that remains true. But this agreement demonstrated that integration does not mean dependence without alternatives. That distinction matters enormously in any negotiation. The side with options negotiates differently than the side without them. And by publicly unveiling a massive new pathway, Canada changed perceptions about where leverage now sat. Markets reacted accordingly. Currency strength, movement in transport stocks, and attention toward commodities reflected investor recognition that this was more than diplomatic theater. Capital tends to reward countries that expand optionality, secure demand, and strengthen supply chain relevance. Canada had just checked all three boxes in one announcement. For Washington, the deeper issue was not simply that Canada signed a big deal, it was that pressure tactics appeared to have accelerated it. A strategy intended to force concessions had helped create diversification. A campaign designed to isolate had encouraged expansion. That reversal is why the agreement carried such political weight. This was more than a trade deal. It was a geopolitical statement. It said Canada could absorb pressure, adapt quickly, and emerge with stronger alternatives. In modern economic conflicts, victories are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive as contracts, infrastructure, shipping routes, and long-term commitments signed at the exact moment your rival expected surrender. And that is why Canada's massive deal changed the story overnight. The moment Canada's massive deal became public, financial markets began recalculating the balance of power. Investors do not wait for political spin, official explanations, or evening headlines. They react to incentives, risk, and momentum. And on that morning, all three had changed. What had been presented for months as a pressure campaign led by Washington suddenly looked less certain. Canada had not only resisted, it had secured a new economic pathway. Within minutes of the announcement, screens across trading floors from New York to Toronto to London began flashing with sharp moves tied directly to the news. The first reaction came in currencies. The Canadian dollar strengthened as traders interpreted the agreement as supportive for future exports, growth prospects, and investment confidence. A large trade package can improve expectations around revenue flows, industrial demand, and national competitiveness. Even before the full details were digested, the signal was clear. Canada had increased its economic optionality. Currency markets tend to reward countries that appear to be gaining leverage, especially when that leverage comes through long-term contracts rather than short-term political promises. At the same time, the U.S. dollar experienced mixed movement as investors weighed the broader implications for American trade strategy. If Washington's pressure tactics were losing effectiveness, then assumptions about future negotiations could also shift. Currency traders understand something simple but powerful. When geopolitical leverage changes, capital flows can change with it. Equities responded just as quickly. In Canada, transportation firms, rail operators, logistics providers, and companies linked to exports attracted attention. If the agreement translated into real shipments, these businesses stood to benefit from higher volumes and expanded infrastructure demand. Energy producers and commodity-linked names also moved as markets priced in stronger access and potentially steadier demand. For investors, the story was straightforward. More trade usually means more movement, and more movement creates earnings opportunities. In the United States, the reaction was more complex. Some sectors exposed to cross-border competition faced pressure as traders reassessed market share, pricing power, and supply chain dynamics. Exporters that had counted on leverage over Canadian markets now faced the possibility of a more diversified counterpart with stronger alternatives. Certain industrial names traded unevenly as analysts considered whether the new deal would redirect contracts or weaken Washington's negotiating hand. The Dow Jones Industrial Average reflected this uncertainty through sharp swings. It was not a clean collapse or a clean rally. It was a repricing of assumptions. Bond markets also moved. Treasury yields shifted as investors balanced two competing forces. On one side, a stable North American trading environment would normally support growth sentiment. On the other, evidence that political pressure strategies were backfiring introduced uncertainty about future trade policy. When markets cannot clearly define the next move from Washington, capital often becomes more cautious. That caution can appear first in fixed income markets, where institutions quietly reposition before headlines fully settle. Energy markets watch closely as well. Canada remains a major resource supplier, and any agreement involving expanded energy flows can influence pricing expectations, transport demand, and refinery calculations. Even modest changes in anticipated supply routes can ripple through commodity markets because traders price future logistics as much as present barrels. Shipping-related names were another focus. Ports, freight companies, railroads, and warehousing operators all stand to gain when trade corridors deepen. If Canada's New Deal produced sustained cargo movement, then the winners would not be limited to producers. Entire logistical ecosystems could benefit. That is why market reactions often spread far beyond the country making the announcement. Trade deals create secondary and tertiary winners through movement, financing, insurance, equipment demand, and services. Business leaders quickly began issuing statements calling for stability and clarity. Some praised Canada's move as a rational diversification strategy in an era of unpredictable trade politics. Others urged Washington to de-escalate and pursue negotiated certainty rather than retaliatory escalation. Corporate executives rarely enjoy headline wars. They prefer rules they can model, costs they can estimate, and relationships that last longer than news cycles. This moment highlighted a truth legendary investors like Warren Buffett have long understood. Markets can absorb conflict. Markets can absorb taxes, tariffs, and even recessions. But markets reward whoever finds a new path. Capital flows toward adaptability, durable demand, and strategic optionality. That appeared to be exactly what Canada had just created. Before the deal, many assumed Trump still held the pressure leverage. Tariffs, threats, and rhetorical escalation gave Washington visible power. Canada seemed to be the side reacting. But after the announcement, perceptions shifted sharply. Canada now appeared to hold something markets value more than pressure: alternatives. It had diversified buyers, expanded channels, and strengthened bargaining power without firing a single rhetorical shot. That contrast mattered because leverage is partly psychological. If markets believe one side has options, they begin pricing future negotiations differently. And once markets price a new reality, politics often follows. By the closing bell, analysts across major networks were saying variations of the same thing. The announcement was not just economic news, it was strategic news. It suggested that pressure can produce resistance, and resistance can become opportunity. Investors had responded accordingly. What began as a diplomatic headline ended as a market message. Canada had changed the incentive structure in real time, and when incentives change, markets react instantly.